I speak these words in whispers, not out of reverence but out of fear. For to speak too loudly of weakness is to invite judgment, and judgment in the Imperium is as fatal as any blade. They told me from the moment of my rebirth that I was perfection given flesh, that I was the Emperor's will carried in sinew, in bone, in blood that had been made more than human. They told me I was beyond failure, beyond hesitation, beyond flaw. But even then, as a neophyte kneeling beneath the chanting of chaplains, I remember a flicker of doubt. Not a thought, never that, for thought against the grain of doctrine is a sin. It was something smaller, quieter, a tightening of the chest when they called us perfect, a realization that only men who fear cracks build their statues from stone so heavy. Perfection was not a truth, it was a prison. The sermons never ceased. We lived in a choir of war hymns, every corridor echoing with prayers that demanded our loyalty, our obedience, our absolute strength. When we awoke, it was to the sound of steel striking steel, a rhythm meant to remind us that our flesh was not ours. When we ate, it was in silence broken only by the recitation of litanies, so that even the act of feeding our monstrous frames became ritual, a sacrifice to efficiency. And when we dreamed, we were not allowed to. The apothecary's work stripped dreams from us, layer by layer, until even the inner self was forged into a weapon. We became tools that could not imagine what it meant to be anything else. The serfs whispered that we were angels, that we were the Emperor's chosen. Yet in the barracks, when the armor was removed and only scarred skin remained, I could see it in the eyes of my brothers. Angels do not look away from mirrors. We did. The fear was never of death. Death was expected. Death was demanded. No, the fear was of failing to meet the weight of the word they draped over us. Perfect. For what is perfection but a blade suspended above one's head, ready to fall at the faintest tremor? I recall the first time I bled on the training fields after Ascension. The strike had been glancing, a sparring error that split my cheek. The red that spilled down my jaw was not only blood, it was shame. My brothers said nothing. But I saw it in their silence, in the way they turned back to their drills. A wound was not a wound, it was a mark. Proof that beneath the ceramite and the catechisms we were still made of flesh, and flesh is fragile. The chaplains thundered at us daily, "You are the Emperor's will made manifest. You cannot break, you cannot falter, you cannot fail." Their words were not encouragements, they were condemnations yet to be delivered. Perfection was demanded, but it was demanded by voices that never allowed silence. I wonder now if they knew what they were doing. If they knew that every hymn we sang was another stone laid upon our chests, another weight pressing down upon lungs that were not allowed to breathe freely. They must have known. They must have. For the Imperium has never been merciful, only efficient in its cruelties. The truth is this: we were not warriors, not truly. We were statues carved into motion, idols with bolters, prayers that bled. We carried the illusion of divinity into battle, and it was not for us to doubt. The Emperor required no doubts. He required silence, obedience, fire. But I doubted. It began not in thought, but in sensation. The first time I felt hesitation bloom in my chest, it was like a sickness. We were taught to fire without pause, to strike without mercy. Yet there came a day when my finger lingered on the trigger for a heartbeat longer than doctrine allowed. The target still died. The mission still succeeded, but I knew. I knew that for the space of a single breath I had not been what they told me I was, and that knowledge is worse than any blade. For you must understand, when an Astartes fails, it is not the enemy who judges him first. It is himself. We are forged to believe that our will is iron, our faith unyielding. So when a crack appears, however small, it spreads like fire through dry timber. The hymns grow louder, the prayers more desperate, the chaplains more insistent, but none of it mends the fracture. It only deepens the silence beneath the chanting. I have watched brothers pray until their lips bled, not from faith, but from terror. Terror that the Emperor's gaze might find them lacking. Terror that the perfection demanded of us had already slipped through their grasp. And when that terror takes root, perfection becomes not a blessing but a curse. Do you see now? Do you feel it? This is the truth no hymn will tell you. We were not gods, we were not angels, we were not perfect. We were fragile men encased in steel, forced to wear the mask of divinity. and masks, no matter how sacred, will always crack. So I ask again, what happens when the most revered warriors of the Imperium fail? What happens when the illusion breaks, when the perfect reveals its fragility? I will tell you because I was there, I saw it, I lived it, but perfection is fragile, and I have seen it shatter. Silence. That was the first sound of the mission, the absence of it. Not the silence of peace, not the quiet of rest, but the suffocating void that seeps into a warrior's lungs when he waits too long for the order to kill. We had gathered in the belly of the strike cruiser, our boots magnetized to the decking, the stale tang of recycled air pressing against our tongues. The void ship's corridors stank of machine oil and ozone, the scent of a vessel forever on the brink of war. Every lumen globe hummed, flickering with faint distortions that cast our shadows long and broken across the walls. I remember the shadows most of all, each one stretched and twisted, as if the ship itself sought to remind us that we were not men, not angels, but something caught in between. I gripped my bolter as though it were a lifeline. Its weight was familiar, a promise that even in hesitation, firepower remained absolute. Around me, my brothers said nothing. Their armor clicked faintly with each shift, ceramite plates grinding together like teeth. No prayers rose, no hymns were whispered. We had already bled those into the air in the hours before, repeating the Emperor's name until our throats grew raw. Now there was only waiting for the order. The chaplain had told us the mission was simple: breach, purge, cleanse. The words were clean, unambiguous, but they carried with them the inevitability of slaughter. Hundreds would die by our hands, and still we were told it was mercy, for the Emperor's will is mercy whether it scalds or sanctifies. And so we stood in that void-born womb of iron, suffocated by expectation. Time is a strange thing in silence. Each second stretched, elastic, taut, until even the act of blinking felt like betrayal. My hearts beat in tandem, hammering against my ribs with the rhythm of a war drum, yet no signal came. No bark from the Vox, no command to descend. The delay was small at first, perhaps a minute, perhaps two, but hesitation, once tasted, becomes poison. I saw it in the faces of my brothers, though they were hidden behind helms of sculpted steel. I felt it in the stillness of their postures, in the way their gauntlets tightened on weapons. Hesitation was not permitted. It was heresy to the rhythm of war, and yet it seeped in. The stench of ozone thickened. The ship's engines roared distantly, a reminder that space itself pressed against the hull like an ocean of black water eager to swallow us whole. My mind turned not to glory, not to duty, but to the endless waiting. What were we waiting for? Who faltered? Whose tongue had failed to shape the kill order? When the Vox finally crackled, it was not with the roar of command, but with distortion. Static hissed, words half-formed, syllables lost to the machine spirit's discontent. The order did not come. Only fragments: stand, delay, breach, hold. Confusion. A single word whispered in my skull, not aloud, never aloud, but I felt it echo between us nonetheless. Then the breach. We descended, not with clarity, but with uncertainty braided into our every step. The drop pod slammed into soil, the retroburn screaming against the void. The doors burst open with hydraulic violence, smoke spilling into the air, and the world beyond awaited us like an open wound. The city was already burning. Ash fell in veils from a sky choked with fire, each flake glowing faintly before extinguishing itself upon ruined stone. The streets twisted like the entrails of some colossal beast, ruptured and bleeding. Civilians ran, stumbled, died, cut down by forces unseen in the smoke. And still no clear order reached us. We advanced by instinct alone. Bolters thundered, spitting mass-reactive shells that turned flesh into ruin. Flamers washed corridors in purifying fire. Yet something was wrong. Something in the marrow of the mission was broken. The kill order had not aligned. The targets had not been marked. And in that hesitation, in that pause where command should have been absolute, the enemy had moved. They were not Xenos, not demons, not the twisted abominations sung of in midnight sermons. They were men, men with fear in their eyes and rebellion in their blood. They had fortified positions we should have shattered in the first moments of descent. They had drawn civilians into their barricades, using flesh as shields. And because the order had stuttered, because the Emperor's will had been delayed, we met them not with overwhelming force but with chaos. The first breach was ours, but the second was theirs. Gunfire tore the air apart. Autoguns rattled, lashbeams carved lines of red through smoke. I felt impacts slam into my armor, ricocheting, bruising. My brothers fell, not slain outright but staggered, broken in formation. The machine spirit of my bolter screamed as I unleashed shot after shot, but the rhythm was lost. War is a hymn, and without rhythm it is nothing but noise. Noise. That is what the mission became: screams, shouts. The clatter of metal, the hiss of burning oil, the wet crunch of flesh torn apart. No clarity, no cohesion. We had been bred to be instruments of perfection, yet in that city of ash and sorrow, we were nothing but blunt edges striking blindly. The enemy did not roar. They did not charge with fearless fury. They simply held, and it was enough. Enough to stall us, enough to twist the flow of battle, enough to fracture the illusion of inevitability we carried into every war zone. And through it all, the silence of command remained. Orders came too late, fragmented, contradictory. Advance, hold, cleanse, wait. Each word like a blade carving hesitation deeper into our marrow. I remember the moment it broke fully. A civilian, no older than a child, ran into the street before me, eyes wide with terror, clutching a makeshift explosive strapped with crude wires. My bolter was raised, but in that instant of pause I saw not an enemy, not a rebel, but a trembling figure caught in the crossfire of a war he did not shape. I hesitated. The explosion tore the street apart. When I rose, the world had become a haze of fire and blood. My brothers lay scattered, some burning, some unmoving. The enemy had surged into the gap, pouring through the breach we had failed to seal. Civilians screamed, crushed between walls of ceramite and waves of desperate flesh. We were supposed to be perfect. We were supposed to strike like thunder, unyielding, unstoppable. But perfection does not hesitate, and we had. The mission did not fail in a roar. It failed in a pause, a heartbeat of uncertainty that stretched wide enough to consume an entire world. And in that pause, a world was lost. The war zone had fallen silent long before the sermons began. Not the silence of victory, nor the merciful quiet of the dead, but the silence of a world abandoned, its cities reduced to husks, its people turned to ash. That silence clung to us, even as we returned to the void ship that had borne us into failure. It weighed more than armor, more than bolters, more than the dust of the battlefield itself. I thought, foolishly, that command would weigh the failure in terms of strategy, that they would count the lost strongpoints, the wasted munitions, the bodies scattered in flame-scorched streets. But the Imperium does not measure in numbers. It measures in faith. And by that measure, we had failed utterly. The chaplains knew before the words were spoken. They felt it in their bones, as if their Crozius arcanums throbbed with judgment. Their sermons grew darker with each cycle of the ship's lumen globes. No longer were their words litanies of strength or hymns of endurance. They became sharp-edged things, sermons spoken like knives pressed against our throats. I sat in the chapel of steel and incense, the flickering candles choking in recycled air. The vox hymns echoed through the ship's corridors, each syllable layered with accusation. To falter is to betray, to hesitate is to sin, to fail is to spit upon the Emperor's light. The words rang in my helm long after the sermons ended. We were not addressed as warriors anymore. We were addressed as examples, warnings. Living scars carved into the ship's memory. I had thought our failure ended in the rubble of the city below, but no. In the Imperium, failure never ends where the guns fall silent. It lingers. It rots. It seeps like oil into every crevice of faith. Brothers who once spoke freely to me now averted their eyes as though I carried contagion. Whispers crept through the ranks. Not loud, never loud. Paranoia is too subtle for that. Instead, it was glances over shoulders, half-formed murmurs, prayers muttered just a little too forcefully when I entered a chamber. I felt the weight of it pressing down, not from my commanders, but from the very machinery of belief. The ecclesiarchy thrives on certainty. Failure breeds doubt, and doubt is poison. Poison must be purged. The chaplains called it penance. But it was not penance. It was a slow suffocation. Our rations were cut by decree, not because the ship lacked supply, but because hunger breeds humility. Training drills doubled, trebled, until our muscles trembled and our armor reeked of stale sweat and blood. But still, it was not enough. The sermons followed us into every corner. I remember waking in the barracks to the drone of a Vox recorder looped endlessly above my head. The Emperor watches. The Emperor counts. The Emperor does not forgive. The phrase etched itself into my skull, repeating with each breath until sleep was nothing but a dream of fire and judgment. I woke screaming once, the words torn from my throat before I even knew I had spoken them. Around me, my brothers stirred, and in their silence I heard their thoughts, that perhaps the Emperor had already abandoned us. Faith should have united us. Instead, it divided. One by one, my brothers broke under the weight. A warrior who had fought beside me since the earliest campaigns fell to his knees mid-drill, sobbing prayers into the decking until the chaplain's crozier silenced him forever. Another ceased to speak at all, his mouth forever moving in silent litany, eyes blank, as if he no longer looked upon this world but only upon the Emperor's judgment in the next. And still, the sermons grew darker. The ecclesiarchy has many voices, and they all found their way into the ship. Preachers from the fleet barked across the Vox, their words venomous. A single brother's doubt infects a chapter. A single chapter's sin stains the Imperium. The stain must be burned away. Each syllable was directed at us, though our names were never spoken. It became a parable, a living heresy dragged from one end of the vessel to the other as proof of what happens when faith falters. I began to feel it in my flesh. My skin crawled beneath my armor as though unseen eyes stared through every seam, every fracture. The lumen globes above seemed to flicker with judgment, their light turning cold, surgical, stripping me bare. I could not breathe in the chapel anymore. The incense became choking smog, heavy with guilt. And so I turned inward. I thought of the city. The ash falling like snow, the child with the explosive eyes, the moment of hesitation that unraveled all. I told myself it had been seconds, less than seconds, that no mortal or transhuman could have chosen differently. But the sermons reminded me otherwise. To falter is to betray. There was no room in the Imperium for human measure. There was only faith. And in that calculus I had already been weighed, judged, and found wanting. One mistake should have ended with us. One battle, one broken world buried and forgot. But faith is not so kind. Faith spreads, it echoes, it festers. The contagion grew. The whispers became louder. Other units began to avoid us entirely, as though even proximity might infect their purity. Servitors assigned to our maintenance clicked and whirred with unease, their machine spirits faltering. Even the ship's corridors seemed narrower when I walked them, as though iron itself recoiled from my steps. The Emperor does not forgive. Not truly. Forgiveness is weakness, and weakness is death. We carried our guilt like chains, each link heavier with every liturgy, every condemning glance, every pause of silence when we entered a hall. We thought we had failed a mission. In truth, we had failed the Imperium. And in failing the Imperium, we had failed the Emperor himself. One mistake became more than failure. One hesitation became more than doubt. One mistake became a contagion, and we became its carriers. The sermons ended, or rather, they changed. Where once the chaplains had roared of fire and judgment, now the words were softer. The silence between them stretched longer. The accusations no longer came from the pulpit or the Vox, but from behind eyes that lingered too long, from the pauses that cut like knives when names were spoken. That was when I knew the Inquisition had come. They did not arrive with banners. No trumpets heralded them. They did not stride down the ship's corridors in resplendent armor as saints of judgment. No, inquisitorial agents came like frost, unseen at first, felt before they were known. Corridors grew colder. Conversations grew quieter. The very lumen strip seemed to burn dimmer, though I knew it was only my imagination feeding upon itself. But then came the questions, not shouted, not roared, but whispered, repeated, pressed into me until my every answer bled uncertainty. I was summoned from the barracks without ceremony, stripped of helm and blade, led into a chamber of steel walls and a single chair. The chair faced a circle of shadows, men and women cloaked in black, their sigils concealed, their eyes brighter than any lumen. "Tell us," they asked, "when did you first doubt?" I tried to speak of the battle, of the city and its ruins, of the timing, the tactics, the enemy's movement. They did not care. They cut me down with a gesture, voices like scalpels peeling away my words. "No," they said, "not what happened. When did you first doubt?" The question hung heavier than any battlefield wound, for to them strategy was nothing. Faith was everything. Again and again they asked. The same words, the same tone, the same silence that followed when I faltered, when I hesitated. They circled me like predators, though their boots never moved. It was not my flesh they sought to pierce, but my soul. They looked at me as though my chest were glass, as though my marrow might reveal a secret I myself did not know. I told myself, I am Astartes, I am unbreakable, but the Inquisition does not break you with pain. Pain is too obvious, too crude. They break you with repetition, with silence, with the erosion of certainty until every thought you hold begins to decay. Why did you pause when the child appeared? Why did you hesitate at the order? Why did you not fire when you should have fired? Each time I answered, they repeated the question, as though my own words condemned me. At first I thought it was only me, that I alone bore the weight of their suspicion. But when I returned to the barracks, I saw it in the eyes of my brothers, the same hollowed stare, the same trembling of gauntleted hands. One of them mouthed the words silently as though they still echoed in his skull. "When did you first doubt?" The interrogations continued without end. Day and night lost meaning. The ship's chronometers might as well have been shattered glass. Some of us were summoned twice in a single rotation. Others not at all, which was worse, because silence in the Inquisition's hands is heavier than chains. They did not accuse us of heresy, not openly. That would have been a mercy. No, they accused us of nothing. They asked, they listened, and they waited for us to accuse ourselves. Every breath became a confession, every pause a sin, every silence an indictment. I began to wonder whether the questions themselves carried a poison, that perhaps there was no rot within me, but by asking, by forcing me to peer into the shadows of my soul, the Inquisition planted it there. Each time I answered, I felt less certain of what truth had ever been. Did I doubt? Did I falter? Was my hesitation my own, or had it been placed within me by the enemy long before the battle began? This was their power, to dissect not the body but the spirit, to peel away armor, muscle, bone, until only the fragile soul remained, raw and trembling. The Inquisition does not seek truth. The Inquisition seeks certainty, and in their gaze, even the innocent are guilty. I remember the sound of one of my brothers screaming as they dragged him back from the chamber. Not a battle cry, not the roar of rage, but a broken sound. The sound of a warrior who had fought in 1,000 campaigns but found no weapon to defend himself against a whisper. He did not return the next cycle. His bunk lay empty. No one asked where he had gone. We all knew. The dread of it crept deeper than any blade could. To fall to the enemy's guns is one thing. To die on a battlefield is honorable. But to vanish into the Inquisition's silence, to be erased as though you had never lived, that was terror beyond words. And it spread. We began to turn on ourselves without realizing it, each of us watching the other for the faintest tremor of voice, the slightest falter in prayer. Every mistake, every stutter, every breath out of rhythm with the litany became reason for suspicion. Where once we had fought as brothers, now we stood apart, shadows stretched between us by the Inquisition's hand. The chaplains no longer spoke. Their silence was permission enough. It was not only the battle we had lost, it was our unity, our trust. The chain that bound us had been severed, link by link, until nothing remained but suspicion, and through it all I felt their gaze. Even when I slept, even when the lights dimmed, I felt the Inquisition's eyes upon me, as though they watched from the cracks of my dreams, as though every breath I took was catalogued, every heartbeat measured against a standard I could never reach. There was no battlefield anymore, no enemy charging through smoke and fire. Only the slow dissection of the soul, the scalpel of questions carving deeper with each passing day. I thought once that death was the greatest fear a warrior could face. I know now that it is not. The greatest fear is the silence after the question has been asked, because in that silence you begin to hear your own voice betray you. And so the truth became clear, more horrifying than any demon, any Xenos, any heretic's flame. It was no longer the enemy we feared. It was our own shadows. There was a time when the mess hall roared with voices. Not laughter. Astartes are not given to mirth, but with the deep resonance of shared tales, the echo of battles recounted in the low growl of warriors who had carved history with bolter and blade. Even silence once had been comfortable. The silence of brothers sharpening chainswords side by side, of warriors reciting the litanies of readiness while servitors clanked through the rows with rations. That silence is gone. What remains is not quiet, but something worse. A suffocating stillness that presses down on the skull until even the scrape of a spoon against a tin tray feels like blasphemy. When the Inquisition left us to our thoughts, the true rot began. It started with the smallest of things. A brother reciting a prayer too quickly. Another pausing too long before the final line. Voices that once blended seamlessly into the Emperor's hymn now wavered like fractured glass. And we noticed. Emperor, forgive us, we noticed. I saw it in the mess hall first. Long benches once filled with the weight of camaraderie now separated by gaps, brothers choosing their place with the calculation of soldiers laying a trap. One sat too far to the left, another opposite, their eyes not meeting but never leaving each other. The food was the same, the servitors unchanged, but the air tasted different, metallic, tainted, and the whispers sharpened. No one spoke them aloud, not at first. It was in the shifting of shoulders, the tilt of a head, the mutter half hidden behind a prayer. But I could hear them. We all could, like knives being whetted in shadow. When an Astartes takes the battlefield, he is trained to see weakness in the enemy, to read every tremor of the foe's stance, every flicker in their eyes. But turned inward against brothers, that clarity becomes a weapon far crueler. I remember the first time I noticed the tremor. Brother Cassian, his hand steady as iron through 100 sieges, let his gauntlet shake as he lifted his cup. A tremor so small a mortal would not have seen it. But we saw. I saw. My gaze locked on it as though it were a beacon, and when he set the cup down, my eyes did not leave him. Did the others see it too? Were they staring as I stared, waiting, cataloging, condemning? Cassian's hands clenched into fists, his knuckles whitening. He did not drink again. It should have been nothing. A fleeting weakness, a muscle strained, but it became more. By the next cycle, the whispers had changed shape. His name no longer spoken with reverence but with doubt. The tremor had become evidence. Astartes are not supposed to feel claustrophobic. Our armor itself is a prison of ceramite and adamantium, yet we wear it as second skin. But the mess hall, open, cavernous, filled with the faint echo of servo motors and the constant thrum of the ship's reactor, felt smaller with each passing day, as though the walls drew closer, as though suspicion itself pressed them inward. I began to measure my breaths, to force my voice steady when the prayers came. Each syllable weighed against the ears of those beside me, and in return I weighed theirs. We all did. The litanies grew louder, not in devotion but in desperation, each word spoken like a blade thrust forward in defense, not to honor the Emperor but to prove we still belonged. And still, it was not enough. One evening during the prayer of sustenance, Brother Malchior faltered. Only a heartbeat, only a missed word swallowed in the tide of voices, but I heard it. We all heard it. His eyes widened, his mouth snapping shut as though silence could conceal the absence. The room froze. The chant continued, but every voice was strained now, every syllable sharpened. I felt my gauntlets tighten around the table's edge, the steel groaning beneath my grip. Malchior bowed his head, muttering the lines again beneath his breath. Too late, the damage was done. Afterward, no one sat near him. The fracture spread like rust. Brothers who had once bled for one another now watched from behind masks of prayer. We studied each other as if the enemy had already infiltrated our ranks and wore the faces of those we had loved as kin. I began to wonder, what did they see when they looked at me? Did they notice the way I lingered too long in silence? Did they mark the nights when sleep refused to come, when I stared at the ceiling until the lumens flared awake? Did they measure the tone of my voice, weigh each syllable and find me lacking? The walls closed in further, not the walls of steel, but the walls of eyes. Dozens of eyes, each pair searching for cracks in the armor of faith. And soon it was not the enemy's bolter we feared. It was the gaze of the brother beside us. Suspicion does not strike quickly. It seeps, slow and unseen, into every pore, every breath, until it becomes the air itself. A bolter shell ends you in a heartbeat. Suspicion lingers, festers, gnaws until you no longer remember what trust felt like. I recall the moment I understood this truth. We had been called to the chapel for evening rites. The incense hung thick, bitter with the tang of burning oils. Rows of warriors knelt in silence, each one armored, each one bowed, the chants rising and falling like the tide. I looked left, I looked right, and in both faces I saw not brothers but judges. Silent executioners waiting for my tongue to falter, for my eyes to waver, for my hand to tremble. I realized then that the enemy outside, the heretics, the Xenos, the endless tide of horrors, no longer mattered. They could not wound me more than the doubt that now lived here, among us, within us. Our greatest enemy was not the foe. It was ourselves. The bolter is swift, but suspicion is slower and far crueler. I once believed that death was the worst fate an Astartes could endure. I was wrong. Death is simple. A bolt round to the skull, a blade through the throat, a plasma burst that turns armor into slag and bone into ash. There is pain, yes, but brief, fleeting. Then comes silence, an end. But the Imperium does not always grant us such mercy. Some of my brothers, those who faltered, those whose faith cracked beneath the weight of suspicion, did not die on the battlefield. They were not even granted the clean execution of a bolt pistol pressed to the temple. No, their punishment was slower, crueler. I watched them taken. It began with chains, always chains. Thick, sanctified links of iron dragged across the stone floor of the chapel, their clang echoing like funeral bells. The chaplain spoke no words. The librarians did not look at us. Only the silent warriors of the Inquisition came, their armor marked not with the heraldry of honor, but with the cold, unyielding sigils of judgment. The condemned were bound, wrists shackled, vox screamers clamped to their mouths to silence prayers that no one wanted to hear anymore. Their armor was stripped from them piece by piece, torn away as though it were heretical flesh. I can still hear the hiss of seals breaking, the tearing of sacred oils from their joints, the sudden gasp as ceramite was ripped from scarred skin. They were not allowed the dignity of standing tall. They were dragged, broken, heads bowed as if already corpses, and I could not look away. The first I saw taken was Brother Cashin, the same who had trembled in the mess hall. I told myself the tremor meant nothing, that it could not be proof. Yet when the chains came for him, I did not speak. None of us did. We only watched, silent, as if our stillness might keep suspicion from turning toward us. The black ships awaited him. I had heard whispers of them, the dark vessels that crawled between stars like vultures circling battlefields. They were said to carry psychers, witches, abominations, but also Astartes whose faith had failed. What became of them aboard those ships was never told. Perhaps none returned to speak of it. Perhaps they were not allowed. Cashin never returned. But others did, not as men, not as brothers, not even as corpses. The first time I saw a penitent engine, I did not understand what it was. At a distance, it seemed a machine of war, an armored walker, its limbs thrashing with the fury of a chained beast, flamers spitting purifying fire. But as it drew closer, I saw the truth. Inside the steel frame, bound in restraints of iron and spiked manacles, was a man, a brother. His armor was gone. His body was fused with the machine, bolted into its ribcage, his flesh pierced by needles that fed stims and pain inducers directly into his blood. His head was encased in a steel halo of restraint, his mouth pried open in a scream that never ended. Vox amplifiers caught his cries and hurled them across the battlefield, each wail a hymn of agony. That was his fate, to suffer endlessly, to burn the enemy with fire while burning within, to scream his repentance until his lungs bled, until his throat shredded, until silence would have been a mercy, but silence never came. The machine would not allow it. I knew his voice. It was Malkyr, the one who had faltered in prayer. I wanted to look away. Emperor, forgive me, I tried to look away. But his gaze, through the restraints, through the haze of agony, caught mine. And for one moment I believed he knew me. Did he see me as a brother still? Or did he see me as a coward who let him be taken? The penitent engine lurched forward, and the moment was gone. I could still hear his screams long after the machine disappeared into the smoke of battle. They burrowed into me, crawling beneath my skin, echoing in my skull even as I tried to drown them in the Emperor's litanies. But no prayer could silence them. And Malkyr was not the last. The fates multiplied. The black ships took more. The engines took others. And with each one torn from us, the air grew heavier, the silence sharper, the fear more suffocating. It was not death we feared now. Death was a gift, swift, final. What we feared was survival, to live long enough to be judged unworthy. To feel chains bite into your wrists, to see your armor peeled away like skin, to hear the hiss of the welding torch as it sealed you into a cage of steel, your flesh forever bound to a machine that would not let you rest. I tell you this, the Emperor is merciful, but the Imperium is not. The Imperium remembers your failures longer than it remembers your victories. And for a brother who falters, the path does not end in death, it ends in erasure. Erasure of name, erasure of honor, erasure of the very humanity that once made us sons of the Emperor. I thought of Cassian, swallowed by the black ship. I thought of Malkyr, screaming his repentance across blood-soaked fields. I thought of those still among us, chanting louder and louder each day, their voices cracking with desperation, trying to prove they were not next. And I wondered when my turn would come, because I had begun to feel it too. The hesitation in my voice, the doubt behind my eyes, the tremor in my hands. I began to wonder if the chains had already been forged for me. And in that wondering, a darker thought took root, one I dared not voice, one that spread like a poison. Perhaps the dead were the fortunate ones, because the dead cannot be chained. The dead cannot be bound to screaming steel. The dead cannot live long enough to become something less than human. The dead are free, and I began to envy the dead. Failure does not die when the battle ends. It lingers, it clings, it echoes. I had thought that once chains closed around my brothers, once screams of penitence faded into the smoke of war, the wound would scar and the memory would dull. But I was naive. The Imperium does not forget. The Imperium does not forgive. Our chapter carried it like a brand burned into the flesh of our very name. At first, I noticed it in whispers. Recruits, freshly drawn from the worlds that fed our gene seed, spoke our oaths with hesitation. Their lips faltered as they recited our litany, as though repeating words that had been stained. Their eyes betrayed them, filled with the question they dared not ask, why us? They had heard the stories. All recruits do. Tales spread faster than flame in dry brush. What one regiment whispers on a cold watch, another repeats in barracks a sector away. By the time those words reached our fortress monastery, they had twisted into a kind of curse. Our banners still hung in the great hall, but I saw the difference. Where once the fabric had been kissed with reverence, now the neophytes passed by with lowered gazes, their prayers spoken quickly, half-heartedly. And in the wider Imperium, we became a shadow among chapters. Our name was spoken, but rarely with pride. Scribes hesitated as they wrote it into the annals of campaign histories. Ministorum choirs skipped our heraldry in their hymns, choosing instead to praise chapters whose loyalty shone unbroken. I heard it even on the Vox. Commanders, distant but clear, hesitated before deploying us, as though invoking our name might invite some contagion of weakness. Do you understand what it means to carry that weight? We were not remembered for our victories, not for the countless worlds where our blood had been spilled, nor the Xenos whose corpses lay stacked in our wake. No, the Imperium remembered one thing and one thing only, that we had faltered, that among us there had been doubt, that chains had been needed. That shame was eternal, for the Imperium has no short memory. A single fracture can stain 1,000 years. I began to see it in the way others looked at us. Guardsmen who once gazed upon us with awe now looked with unease, as though wondering if the same weakness that claimed one brother might lurk in all of us. Sisters of battle crossed themselves more fervently when we entered a chapel. Even our own allies in the Adeptus Astartes grew distant, their greetings formal, cold. The worst was the silence. There are songs sung of Astartes' deeds, hymns that echo across cathedrals carved from the bones of planets. Yet none were sung of us. Where once our chapter's victories had been woven into liturgy, now there was omission, an absence louder than condemnation. I remember standing in a cathedral on a liberated world. The choir rose, their voices thundering against vaulted arches, recounting the valor of a dozen chapters who had bled to free the planet. Our banners hung there too, among them. But when the verse came where our name should have been spoken, there was only pause, brief but heavy. Then the hymn carried on, skipping us like a stone over black water. I felt it in my chest, that silence, more piercing than a blade. We were not remembered as heroes. We were remembered as a warning, and warnings endure. The echo of failure seeped into everything. In the recruits, in the liturgies, in the hesitant quill strokes of scribes who wrote our name as if it might taint the parchment itself. It was in the way other chapters measured us with eyes that betrayed calculation. Were we allies or liabilities? Would our stains spread to them if they stood too close? I began to feel as though time itself had turned against us. Even when the years passed, even when new victories were carved in fire and blood, the echo remained. The wound did not heal. The shame did not fade. Generations shifted. Brothers who had known Cassian, Malchior, the others, those whose screams I still heard in memory, fell in battle, their remains honored in tombs of adamantine. But still the echo persisted, carried by those who had never seen the events with their own eyes. That is the cruelty of failure in the Imperium. It does not belong only to those who lived it. It becomes inheritance. It becomes legacy. The neophytes who donned our colors did not stumble, yet they bore the weight of those who had. They fought with the desperation of men already condemned, swinging their blades not for glory, but to prove wrong an Imperium that had already judged them. But no matter how many died with valor, the shadow never lifted. I began to move through existence like a ghost. My victories tasted of ash. My survival became a curse. Every battle won was drowned out by the silence that followed, the reminder that our failures had already defined us. We had become a name to frighten with, a tale whispered to young recruits, hold fast in faith or you will become like them. And so I lived beneath that shadow, not only among brothers but within myself. When I closed my eyes, I saw the chains. I saw Malchior screaming from within the machine. I saw banners trembling in the silence of hymns. But worst of all, I felt the echo. It was no longer something around me. It was inside me, a pulse beneath my skin, a rhythm in my bones, a voice in my skull that whispered not words but wait. The echo of failure, unending, unforgiving. And even now when I close my eyes, when the world falls silent and I am left only with myself, I feel it still. Even when I close my eyes, I feel the echo. And it is endless. There are no hymns for us. The Imperium has many songs, liturgies of triumph, canticles of sacrifice, laments for martyrs. Bells toll across cathedral worlds, their bronze tongues announcing victories carved into the bones of history. Names are etched into marble, prayers inscribed upon adamantine, the deeds of the faithful carried in vox hymns that echo through star systems. But not for us, not for me. I learned that the end of failure is not death. Death is clean, finite. Failure lingers. It is erased not in blood, but in silence. There was a day when I returned to the Hall of Remembrance in our fortress monastery. The air was heavy with incense, the votive candles guttering low as though they too felt the weight of the chamber. Every chapter has such a hall, an archive of victories, a shrine to the emperor's witness of their deeds. I had walked those halls before, surrounded by stone-carved names, records etched deep into ceramite plates. I had once run my gauntlet across their grooves, feeling the cold permanence of our legacy. But that day was different. That day the masons were at work. Their hammers struck not to carve, but to shatter. Names were being erased, not with ceremony, not with reverence, with violence. Each blow chipped away letters, histories, lives. Dust clouded the air like smoke, and the sound of destruction echoed like muted thunder through the chamber. I stood there, watching as centuries of sacrifice crumbled under hammer and chisel. A brother's name struck into nothing. Another ground into silence. The Masons did not look at me. Their faces were hidden behind masks, their hands steady as if they performed a duty sacred in its cruelty. One of them struck at a name I knew. A name I had whispered in battle. A brother I had bled beside. The stone cracked, and where once there had been a mark of permanence, now there was only jagged ruin. It was then I understood the price. The Imperium does not forgive. It does not forget. It erases. It does not merely kill the body. It does not merely strip banners or silence hymns. It scours memory itself until nothing remains but dust in forgotten halls. And in that moment, standing among the ruins of remembrance, I realized I was already dead. The bells tolled above me. I had heard those bells before, ringing to honor the fallen, but their tone had changed. Once they had been solemn, resonant, filled with mourning. Now they rang hollow, their sound closer to a knell for something already lost. It was not for the dead they rang. It was for the forgotten. Elsewhere, I learned, the scribes worked to seal records. I imagined them in their endless archives, robed in parchment, their quills scratching across vellum as they struck out names. I could hear it in my mind, the dry rasp of parchment torn, the soft hiss as seals burned into wax, closing our history forever. Even the machine spirits conspired in the silence. The vox logs that once carried our prayers, our battle cants, were scrubbed, replaced by blank static. The data vaults that once pulsed with our record flickered into blackness. It was annihilation, but not of flesh. It was annihilation of remembrance. And that is worse. To be forgotten is the final death. To have no name, no echo, no place in memory. To have your sacrifices consumed by silence. That is the fate the Imperium reserves for failure. I felt the walls closing in. The echo I had carried for so long, the weight of shame, the whisper of failure, grew quiet, not because it was gone, but because it was swallowed by something larger, a void. The silence became heavier than sound. I began to dream of it. In those moments of uneasy rest, I would walk through empty halls. The banners had rotted to dust, the statues crumbled to faceless stone. The prayers that once hummed in my skull were gone, replaced by the hum of nothingness. My brothers' voices were gone too, swallowed whole. And in that silence, even my own voice faltered. I tried to whisper their names, but my lips moved without sound. I tried to cry out, but the void consumed it before it left my throat. That was the truth I could not escape. The Imperium does not allow failure to endure, even in memory. They burn it, they strike it, they bury it. And in time, even the last witness is consumed. I can feel it happening to me now. I speak, but even as the words leave me, I know they are fading. There are no scribes recording my testimony. No archivist will carve these words into stone. I am a ghost speaking to no one, a voice swallowed in the gulf of time. Even now, as I form these sentences, I can hear them unravel, each word thinner than the last, each phrase more fragile, dissolving as it touches the air. Perhaps you hear me. Perhaps for a moment the sound of my voice trembles in your mind, but it will not last. It will never last. That is the final punishment. Not chains, not pain, not even the echo of failure, but silence. I feel it closing in. The bells toll, but fainter now. The hiss of furnaces consumes the names, but even the crackle fades. The masons strike, their hammers falling, but the sound is distant, blurred as though buried beneath water. And then there is nothing. No hymn, no banner, no name, only silence. My voice weakens. My words dissolve. I am vanishing even as I speak them. This is the end. Not death, not even remembrance of failure. This is erasure. I was a warrior, I was a brother. I was a son of the Emperor's war, but now I am nothing. The silence deepens, and I fade.